Hey there! In this video we're going to cover the CSS font and text properties. Now there are 15 of these, but they're not all important. The chapter covers all of them, but I'm going to talk about which ones we really use a lot, which ones are required, how to use those, and which ones we can sort of forget about. So first we're going to look at the 6 properties that have the word font in them. And these are font family, font size, font weight and style, font variant, and font by itself. So each of these is a separate CSS property. The other CSS properties that are related to font and text styles don't have the word font in them. Some of them have the word text in them. Notice the hyphen, that's required. And some of them don't have the word text or the word font in them. So we'll go over these second, but first the font properties. Now, just quickly, let's go over what is a font, right? A font is a style of typography, and different font families have very distinctive names. And if you're like me, you have a whole lot of fonts on your computer. I'm in the app Font Book, which comes with Macs, and Windows I'm sure has something else. So I've got tons of fonts on here. The one we're looking right now is called Baskerville. A very common one is Arial. You might look at a typewriter font from time to time. So just as a quick look, fonts look really different from each other, right? So when you're going to select a font family to show on a web page, you're going to think about, well, how do you want your page to look? How do you want it to communicate with people? So as I often do, I've got a simple page set up here for us to experiment with. And I'm going to be using the Atom text editor. So I've got a relatively simple HTML page with 3 paragraphs already in it. It's got the text wrapped up in a container div with the ID of container, and that allows me to make it more narrow and put this box around the outside of it. And in my CSS, I've put some styles on the body, and body should always be at the top, with a few exceptions of the style sheet, so that's at the very top. And then I've styled that container div. I have put a border on it, I have given it a width, and I've given it a little padding so that the text isn't touching the edges. I have styled my H1, my top level heading, of which there's only one, with just by taking the margin off of it so it doesn't have extra space. And then I have one little class named Special. And the reason I did this was so that we've got 3 paragraphs, and the top and the bottom paragraph will always stay the same. And when I make changes, they will only affect this middle paragraph because it has on it the class of Special. So our first CSS property that we're looking at today is font family. And professionals will usually specify a default font stack or font family in the body. Okay, so they'll use the body selector at the top of their CSS, and they will put in a font family, and then they may have more than one font family specified. I have only one plus the generic, so I have a total of 2 here. And I want to show you how this looks if I take away my selected font family, which is a sans serif font named Calibri. You use a capital letter, and if this font family had more than one word in its name, we would have to put straight quotation marks around that multi-word font family name. So everything on my page has the font of Calibri if my computer has that font installed on it. And this is true for anybody out there on the web. If I put this up on a web server and you looked at it, or my mother looked at it, or somebody else looked at it on a different computer, if they didn't have Calibri, if they did not have that font, which some computers don't have, what would they see? Well, this is how that works. We're going to simulate that. So I am going to take out the name of the specific font family Calibri. I've left the generic because what would happen if somebody didn't have Calibri, the web browser would default down to the next font name to the right. And if that one wasn't there, it would take the next one to the right of that, and on and on and on, till it got to the generic, which in this case is sans serif. So by saving this and going over here and hitting reload, you're going to see what does the generic look like and how different is it. Well, it's not horribly different, but it is noticeable. So the generic is not going to look exactly like the font you specified, and in fact, none of the fonts you specify are going to space out the same way, right? They're not going to take the same amount of space on the line. You see what happened to the heading here. It fell down to a second line because Arial, or whatever my default sans serif font is, apparently those letters are wider than the letters in Calibri. So let me go back and put that back and save again. And go back and reload just so you can see that difference. Okay, so this is Calibri. Previously, it showed what we would see if we did not have Calibri on this computer. Now, what are these font generics that I referred to? All right, these are explained in the chapter, so you need to look at chapter 12 because there's a fuller explanation. But just basically, you want the last thing in your font stack, that is in the line that starts with font family colon, the last font is a generic, and that will make sure that you have some control over what the user sees, even if they don't have any of the fonts that you recommended on their own computer. So you want to match the generic to the look you want for that font. So the book goes over what is the difference between serif and sans serif. Then this third type, monospace, is a kind of font where every letter takes up the same width as every other letter. I'm going to show you that with the fonts installed on my computer. So here we have a sans serif font, and you can see that the top row from A to M is shorter than the second row from N to Z for both the uppercase and the lowercase letters. And that's because you've got more narrow letters like I and L in the top row. So what about the other one we had looked at before, Baskerville? The same thing. The top row that goes up to M is shorter than the row below it for both uppercase and lowercase letters. So I'm going to now show you a monospace font, and you'll see the difference, okay? A common monospace font on Macs is called Andale Mono, and you can see that the first and second row for both upper and lower case take up the same amount of space. And if you move your eye from the top to the bottom, look at the capital letter I. Look underneath at the letter V and see how the width, the amount of space allotted to the I is the same as for the V. Even the lowercase I takes up the same amount of space. That is what monospace means. So that's a very particular kind of font. Now, with the last two generics that are available to us as CSS values for font family, cursive and fantasy, I recommend that you never, ever, ever use those generics because you really don't know what somebody is going to have for those defaults, for those generics on their machine. So if you want to specify a generic, I suggest you only use one of the top ones, and you want to make sure that that generic is closest to what you want your page to look at for somebody who doesn't have the fonts installed that you want them to have. Now back to our list of font properties, CSS font properties. Font size. As Robbins points out in the book, normally we are going to sort of fix a default size for the whole page. And even though it seems like maybe you shouldn't have to do this, the standard accepted way to do this is to, in the body tag, you will put font size : 100%. And as she points out, when you've got a size measurement following a number, there must be no space, okay? So the number smack up against the percent sign, or if you're using one of the other measurements, you have to have no space between the number and the letters or the symbol. So we put this font size 100% in the body. It normally doesn't make a change to the way the page looks. So if we go over to the page, it looks like this. If we take out font size 100, save, reload, no difference, okay? But it's used by your CSS style sheet when you are going to change some other things. So let's say I come down to the H1 and I want to make it bigger. I feel like it does not look great the way it is. Maybe I want it to be 4 M's, okay? So let's save it, see what that'll look like. It'll get a lot bigger, okay? But the size of the text has not changed at all. So let me remove the increased size on the H1 and put an increased size on the paragraph. Let's say 2M. Save. Reload. The head will go back. And my second paragraph is now a lot larger than the other, okay? So normally what we'll do is we will only change a few items that we definitely want to be bigger or smaller relative to the other things on the page. And we're going to use this kind of relative measurement. We're going to use either MEM, which is explained in the chapter, or we're going to use a percent to make certain items such as a heading or a subheading or one kind of paragraph that maybe you want the introductory paragraph to have bigger text, right? But generally you will stick with whatever the browser does as a default relative size for headings and text, and only select a few things to change their font size. But don't forget, body, specify 100%. It will keep other things from breaking. Also, as the chapter points out, we do not use fixed measurements because they are not responsive. We sometimes, very rarely, use pixels, px. We never use points. We never use print measurements when we are specifying for the web, okay, or for mobile. So px now and then for a border width, sometimes for a margin or padding, but never for font sizes, because then they are inflexible and they're not responsive. Okay, the next two font properties are font weight and font style. And some people get these mixed up. They are very distinctive. Font weight is only for bold and not bold. It is for the heaviness of the font. Font style is for slant. It is for italic or oblique. We almost never use oblique. I never use it. So font style will make something italic or not italic, okay? Let's look over here, and for our paragraphs, let's put in font weight for our special paragraph, and we'll just make it bold, and we will save, and we will reload, and there we've got a bold paragraph. What about if we make a heading? We don't want our heading to be bold. Headings are bold by default. So if we tell it to be normal, save, reload, the heading becomes lighter. Font style. So let us take away the weight. And font style, completely different a completely different property. Italic, this will just be for our paragraph, and we could also add that to our heading, so the two could be combined. Save and reload. And so font weight and style, there you have them. Now, font variant, we hardly ever use this. I don't think I have ever used it. So you can read about that in the book. And the last thing, font by itself. If we use font by itself, it means we have to combine all the things, all the font properties into one line, and order matters and punctuation matters. So where you see that slash, it's very important. So it's easy to mess this up, and I just advise beginners, don't try to do this. Wait until you get comfortable, until you get really good with the sizes, the font families, and all the other things, the line height and things that we haven't covered yet. And then maybe you'll want to use this combined property where you put everything into one. So that's all the font properties for CSS. We're going to cover the text properties in the next video.